All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Trish Tarrant, and I am the Assistant Dean for Graduate Programs here at Salinger. Tonight is our third event in the Salinger Connect webinar series for this academic year. And tonight we'll be diving into supply chain obstacles that we've recently encountered, trends and opportunities in supply chain moving forward. Many of you have sent in questions on this topic on your registration forms, which was very helpful in framing the webinar. If you do have additional questions during the webinar, place them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. We're not sure time-wise if we'll get to them, but if not, we can always address them afterwards. We'll be sending out this recording and can follow up on those questions at that time. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to our moderators, Dr. Ravi Srinivasan and Dr. Jay Brown, who, as many of you know, are professors in the Salinger School of Business teaching operations and process strategy courses. Both Ravi and Jay have a lot of research and expertise and experience in this area, and I know you'll find the next hour very informative. So I'll turn it over to Ravi.
All right, thanks, Trish. All right, welcome everyone. Again, as Trish mentioned, my name is Ravi Srinivasan. Thanks, Jay, for co-moderating this with me. We have an excellent panel here. We have Michael Dockman, who is an alumni of Loyola, and he's currently the managing partner at AMA Capital Partners. He comes in with a lot of high-level experience in terms of investing in various logistics-related activities and so on. And then we have Houston Mason, who's we are excited to have him as our adjunct professor teaching in our undergraduate classes. He was with McCormick before, and then now he's with Can-Am Steel. He's also he was a past president of CSCMP, which is a local chapter of the Professional Society for Supply Chain Professionals. We have Brant Matthews, who is our executive in residence, also an McCormick alumni, and served as the Global Strategic Procurement VP before, and also worked with Johnson & Johnson and so on. So he's coming in with rich experience there. And we have Max Mendez, who is an alumni. I've known Max for a long time. He works for Hopkins. He's managed their inventory, their SAP system, and so on. So there's a lot of wealth of experience that he's bringing in. So we're very excited to have all of them here to serve on this panel. Let me start off with a brief overview of what we're going to do. The agenda is basically, I want to start off with some examples of how businesses responded. And then Jay is going to talk a little bit about the industry level trends. And then we're going to have a series of 6 questions that we're going to ask the panelists. And then they can provide their input and chime in and think about how they have observed or dealt with in the last few years and where they see things are going. And then we're going to have concluding remarks of this. And if we have any time in between, we'll try to address some of the audience questions as well. All right, let me jump in right away. Some of the examples, again, you may have observed this as we experienced this in the last few years in terms of how companies have responded. So one of the things that I was fortunate enough to do is to write this article by compiling all the different examples. And the key thing that we've observed, and we've it's easily relatable, is this idea that there were a lot of demand and supply mismatches. And if you think about it, if you've gone to your retailer or out there, they had so many different requirements in terms of our changes in operating procedures. Think about mask requirements, social distancing, floor markers, all kinds of changes that they have to really pivot right there instantaneously almost to accommodate this new way of doing business. And same with manufacturers and employers as well. So think about all the mask requirements, random testing. I'm sure some of you have gone through this and experienced this as well. Now, specifically, I want to address a few examples, and this was one of the questions that we got from the audience. And this is some companies, and notably alcohol manufacturers and clothing manufacturers, they realized, well, we could do something good in terms of respond to this need in the society. And what they've done is essentially repurpose their capacity to produce hand sanitizers or non-surgical face masks. So this was a really nice way to kind of respond to the societal needs in a very quick manner. We also noted that there are interesting trends that you observe, and this is both in the UK and the US, where you have competitors come together and actually work together, and especially in terms of producing ventilators and so on. We noted that there's a lot of these kind of collaborations that happen that you would normally think that these were competitors out there. And then the other thing that we have noted as well is you had some interesting new products and services that are being offered, and two of them that stand out, at least for me. One is this idea of QR codes. You probably have seen this when you go to your restaurants. Not as popular right before the pandemic, but once the pandemic hit and you have a lot of the restaurants adopting this and essentially moving towards this almost on a permanent basis now as well. And then my favorite, and this is was something that you would not even think about, is there was an overproduction, if you will, of dragon fruit in Vietnam as an example. And then they could not ship it out to their usual markets out there. So they repurposed, and you had this bakery come in and think about it and say, okay, how can I use this, all the perishable product out there? And they were able to come up with this baguette and buns using dragon fruit. And even KFC Vietnam actually introduced this, and it's a huge hit, and that's a new market. So you start to see how things are being responded to for this kind of an interesting scenario. So with that, Jay, if you want to take over the industrial level trends.
Sure. I thought we'd look at some industrial level trends. And as Ravi detailed, companies have adapted in many different ways. The pandemic really disrupted business as usual and profoundly impacted supply chains. So I thought we'd briefly look at some of those supply chain shocks as shown here. In the first graph, we see inventory to sales ratios at the beginning of the pandemic initially shot up with too much inventory and then sharply rebounded to a situation of shortages. Second graph shows another shock where the price of freight shipping just skyrocketed as supply chains looked to recover from the shortages. And then finally, the third graph here shows manufacturing input items, raw materials and components, became scarce. And as a result, the production of goods plummeted. So we really see some big shocks there. Then moving on to this slide here, the pandemic changed supply chains. And this is just ways in which it changed. It's just kind of a summary. So the first one, the supply chains are now a key focus of the C-suite. What we see here is the level of emphasis companies are placing on supply chains. So for example, in a McKinsey survey, CEOs noted supply chain turmoil as the #1 threat to growth. And the mentions of supply chain rose over 400% in Fortune 500 company earnings calls in Q3 of 2021 versus the previous year. So really a big emphasis now on supply chain. Looking at the second one here, business continuity is more important than costs. So really resilience, flexibility, visibility are now seen as paramount, replacing cost reduction in focus. Moving on to the third one, buyer-supplier relations have been altered. So the desire now really is a lot greater for information sharing and collaboration. So all these ideas of sharing information and collaboration has increased to try to improve supply chains. Moving to the fourth one, supply chain workarounds are now standard. Companies are now taking matters more into their own hands in a lot of different ways. In-house trucking, buying warehouses, using alternative ports, shifting production closer. These types of moves give companies more control over the supply chain and avoid the potential for these shocks. And then finally, the inventory playbook has been ripped up. So concepts like just-in-time, a popular inventory concept to reduce costs, is being questioned by companies for a lot of different key components. We see that safety stocks have risen, and companies are actually, this is interesting, hiding stockouts by reconfiguring store displays and pointing consumers to other products to help mask any inventory issues that they may have that may turn off customers. So again, this emphasizes the importance of companies have placed on wanting resilient, flexible supply chains. And so with that, let's turn it over to questions to our panelists.
So Thanks, Jay. Hopefully this kind of sets the stage a little bit, and what we're going to do is have our panelists chime in a little bit. As I mentioned when I was introducing them, we have a wealth of experience that they're bringing to the table here. So let's start with that. Let's start with the first question here. How did the logistics change or needs change during and after the pandemic? And specifically, if you want to talk about the volume changes or source or destination mix or any other kind of changes that you've observed, if you want to chime in.
Okay, I take that one, Ravi. So Houston Mason here. So I would say that just a couple of high level things there. As the pandemic started, of course, demand went way down in every industry, every part of the world. So therefore, it definitely took a dive to the logistics market, right? So a lot of capacity was unused, the first few months of the first year of the pandemic, whatever you want to say. And then when we were able to still get back out, life restarted, industry restarted to some a bigger degree. Then you had a lot of demand, you had a lot of capacity that came back into the market. So at that point, freight rates really shot up. You're talking this point, 21 really, in essence, when really freight rates across all modes really shot up significantly. And then at that point you had, a lot of volume, you had a lot of inventories being filled as well, right? A lot of inventory orders. And so just a lot of demand and a lot of price inflation for freight. And then, once all that demand inventory was kind of fulfilled, then you had the situation where it kind of went back down, right? So then you had excess capacity, you had prices, and really to this point, prices in the market have generally stayed depressed. Now you have the Red Sea situation, of course, a shock like that, where obviously that drives ocean rates back up certainly. But in terms of dry van, I work with a flatbed in my industry, LTL, those types of business, their modes, they have really remained depressed. And the question now is what happens now with where the economy goes, where the government might go with interest rates, so forth. How does that affect demand and companies' decisions on big ticket items? So I'd say that's really been the main thing I've seen is the aspect of the demand, how it's affected rates, and how it's affected capacity really throughout the time since the pandemic. And one other brief comment, I would say that what I've seen in 30 years of being in the freight market in many different modes and industries is that the cycles used to be 2 or 3 years or so, where you'd have maybe in the favor of shippers, and then the next 2 or 3 years, they're much more gradual cycles. Now you've seen them really, it could be annual to some degree, right? So it's really made a much more volatile and quick, quick impacted market. So
I will also chime in from my perspective from healthcare. So I think we have the opposite problem as most of the industries, our demand actually increased, right? Especially for PPE supplies. So because of the new clinical protocols and safety measures, we see a skyrocketing demand for PPE supplies. The challenge we have was we had high demand but no supply, right? So what do we do next? So the first thing that we did is we tried to do conservation strategies for the supplies that we have in our distribution center, right? That's what we said. How long can we keep this inventory? How can we partner with the clinical teams to extend the life of those products when appropriate? The other thing that we did as the slide showed, how do we get some out to the clinical partners to do patient care? So 2 examples that I would like to share is, for example, we use reusable gowns in the hospital settings, but there was nowhere to be found. So we learned that Ford Motor Company was proposing and has done some studies on the airbag material that we can convert it onto gowns. So we talked to Ford and say, hey, can you send us some samples? We have the clinical teams and other appropriate aren't betting those reusable gowns, and then we move reusable gowns made out of airbags into our distribution channel. But now we were faced with how do we handle those, right? In the past, the disposable gowns, you just use it and toss it. Now we were challenged on how are we gonna clean them, how are we gonna distribute it, and how are we gonna collect them? Because now as it is dirty, we need to go back into circulation. How are we gonna clean it? So for us, some of the challenges that we have with the high demand. Another example to share is with the COVID vaccine. So the government told us for our all of the hospitals in Johns Hopkins, they will only deliver the vaccines to one hospital, right? They're not gonna be delivering to the different entities that we own. So we were challenged to build in our distribution center that only used to house medical disposable supplies. Now we need to make accommodations for the vaccine. So we bought those refrigerators with low temperatures. I don't know, you remember those vaccines needs to be in very low temperatures. So the logistic challenge for that is like when those freezers are open, you have 1 minute to extract the product. The vials and the vaccine get compromised if you don't move it from the freezer into the cooler within 1 minute. So we have a team dedicated to release those orders at a specific time because we couldn't do it very frequent. I mean, you do a batch and then you have to wait later to do the next batch, right? And then we have to hire a third party carrying those coolers directly into the pharmacies because it was only 8-hour shelf lives once the vials or the vaccine was removed from the freezers. So that's the interesting pieces that we deal with in healthcare during those times.
All right, no other questions no other responses on question 1. We'll move to question 2, which is how is technology changing supply chain strategy and execution in your organization or industry?
Well, let me piggyback on what I was just saying. So because we have to do a lot of supply conservation, one of the things that we have to do, let me just explain how do inventories consume in a hospital. So we have these vending machines that sit on a clinical areas. And in those clinical areas, they trigger orders to our distribution center at a specific point in time, right? So we need to create a logic that for these PPE or restricted items that they don't get replenished regularly because we need to, again, to make sure that we conserve that inventory and we will disperse it equally and appropriately, right? So we wanted to have the control of who gets what so everybody will get a fair share. So we create logic on our system to block specific orders or only reduce partial orders of what these machines or vending machines were ordering. So that also helps us a little with we have a lot of substitution and back orders as everybody else in these industries. So that also helps us to leverage those tools that we have in house to keep delivering product as much as we could.
Well, hey, good evening, everybody. It's great to be here with you. I'm Michael Dockman. I've spent the better part of my career involved in the financing and the operations of ships and trains. The large essential assets that form a key part of the supply chain. And it's interesting when I go back to when I started out, whether it was a rail car or a ship, a lot of times you didn't quite know where it was. They were just out there operating, and gradually over time, we've added more and more technology to these assets in the first instance just to know where they are and to track them. But increasingly, then we're putting sensors, we're putting computers, individually on these assets as a way for companies to aggregate the operational data from any particular voyage or route. And then generatively process that data to then improve navigation, improve maintenance. It's been progressive, but certainly since the pandemic, it's ramped up immensely. And so the buzzword today is AI. I can't quite tell you exactly a specific AI application, but I can tell you that that in my investment banking practice, we are more and more engaged with startups and founders who are focused on how to take all of this data that these assets generate and how to process it and then bring it back in to improve operations, improve operational efficiency, improve emissions and environmental impact. It's an incredibly dynamic field. How we apply technology to these assets, and ultimately with these assets, as you can imagine, safety is of the paramount importance. And so the aggregation of the data, the processing of the data, it makes those who are operating these assets smarter. So it's not just reducing cost, it's improving safety. So it's exciting. It really is exciting. And I think it's just going to continue to get really, really interesting.
That's wonderful. I think it almost seems like we're slowly getting closer and closer to the Star Trek way of doing business, which is amazing. I'm looking forward to that.
Indeed.
So the other question that we thought we would ask the panelists based on all the questions we got were, what are some of the challenges that your organization or industry is facing with regards to labor or capacity? And specifically, I think some of the things that were raised are things like labor availability, skills gap, capacity issues, and so on. So if you can elaborate on that, that would be wonderful.
Sure, I'll take a first crack at this one. So yeah, there's been a lot of impact from a labor standpoint. I mean, we're still finding, whether it's individuals to man vessels, individuals to operate trains, individuals to on shore side to work in repair facilities, manufacturing facilities. Particularly on the land side, I'm thinking about this country. Labor is a challenge. It's hard to find people. Some of these jobs are you're out in the elements, you're away from home for a while. That goes for trucking as well, and it's harder and harder to recruit for these positions when there are a lot of other positions out there that don't have the sort of physical and personal impacts that some of these jobs in the supply chain have. So it means you have to pay more. And so I do, we touched a little bit as we were prepping for this webinar, we were talking a little bit about inflation too. And we've certainly seen it in what we have to pay mariners, what we have to pay folks shoreside. I don't see it coming down. I think we're going to have to continue to make these attractive positions that pay really well, to attract the people that we need. So I do think that this labor cost inflation that we've been seeing, in the sectors I'm involved in, I mean, Houston's point earlier, we've definitely seen in certain sectors, we've seen the pricing come down, but in these labor sectors that I'm in, I'm seeing, supply shortages, the cost is higher, and that inflation bit is working its way into not just the labor component of the cost of production, but some of the material costs of production as well. I know we've seen the cost to build a new ship go up by 40% in the last 3 years. The cost to build a new rail car is going up by 30% in the last few years. That's meaningful. These are long-lived assets. They're going to be out operating for a long time. So the people putting the money into it today, they need to earn a return on that cost for a long period of time. So, I know there's a lot of hope and enthusiasm for lower inflation. But I think there's a certain level of embedded cost that isn't going to be going away for a while. So those are my comments on that.
I can add a couple of comments to that. So I'd say I'd talk about it from two fronts. One, I mentioned it just briefly earlier, the capacity aspect of just the pandemic aspect and just, where there was kind of a gold rush, if you will, where, there was a lot of demand to chase. And so people that might not have been in the business, got a truck, got a license, got a regulatory license from the government to be a truck driver, truck operator. And so now what you're seeing is that some of those people have fallen out of the industry, right? So that's kind of number one. I would say that kind of a remnant from like the 2010 era, where you had things like CSA 2010 that came in and were meant to drive more safety in the industry. You saw a lot of capacity go out in that time frame, 2010 to 2015-ish or so. Some of that's never come back, and probably maybe for the better, but probably for the better, I would say, for sure. Some better operators, but percentage wise, but some capacity, constraints. And then I think the last thing I would mention here, is one that if you're in the industry, if you read the press, you certainly have heard a lot about, the driver shortage. It seems like we've had a driver shortage for, I don't know, 20 years, potentially certainly since the 2010, CSA 2010, but even before that. And I guess, okay, so you could say it. There's a couple stats around it. You can look at some different surveys. I've done a little bit of research, even though I'm just an adjunct professor, but I've done some research in my time about that. And what I found is that a couple things. I could probably do a survey and see what everybody would guess here, but the average age of a truck driver is in the late 40s. So most of what I've seen, it hovers around the 48, 49, maybe 50 range. The average age of a truck driver. So that's number one. Number two, when you look at the number, you categorize, sort of break down the number of drivers that are in each category. When you look at the drivers that are, and let me also add, the average retirement age is about low 60s, so 61, 62, right? So kind of do the math there. And then in terms of how close that average is to retirement, the next decade or so, right? And then, about 70% of the driver base overall, excuse me, has 20 plus years experience. So again, do the math there, 40 plus. And then that means that you've got, the remainder that are 20 to 40 in different ranges that are 30%. So it's a lot of numbers, but I think when you think about it, I kind of term it as a retirement tsunami coming. That you're not replacing, your average age is getting older. When you look at some older surveys, the average age was low 40s to mid 40s, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years ago. So again, you're seeing average age creep up, which that just tells you you're not replacing drivers as rapidly. And so, you think about now to the next 10 years, you really see that coming. And then you put in all the other factors I've mentioned in terms of just capacity going down generally and tightening up. So I guess, there's a lot of factors that really tie into that driver shortage you hear about. And yeah, it's really, a real issue. And then I think you sort of bump up the next decade with the whole, automated vehicle kind of discussion. That's a whole other webinar perhaps, but how fast could that, or how do we think that's going to permeate, and how do those two kind of trends mesh as you go forward in time? But as you speak now, I think it's definitely real that, the driver shortage is real. And I think that average age is probably going to start creeping up. And again, at this last point, as Michael alluded to, just some of the aspects of truck driving, right? As attractive as it can try to be made with pay and all that, and trying to have jobs where drivers can be home more, it's still a hard job, right? I've had a chance to ride with drivers before, on some long trips, and it's not easy, but you can make a good living, but it's not easy. It can be not easy life. And so, it's a challenge overall, I think, for the supply chain industry as a whole, as it pertains to transportation, which is a big part of it.
Yeah, Houston, can I just ask a quick follow-up? I'm just wondering about that
Sure.
the truck driver situation, as far as, do you foresee like reconfiguring routes as it becomes more of a shortage to maybe take advantage of more double trailers? Or do you just think it's a matter of trying to attract more drivers, or is it the technology aspect? Like, where do you see it going?
It could be all of everything. And I think, Jay, that the one thing is it could force that, right? It sort of forces the issue to some degree, right? I think it's a good point you're making. It could force the issue that you have less capacity to work with, right? So you have less carriers out there. So it's always good to be more efficient with your transportation. But but I think overall it as demand, and I think it'll be interesting in the next year, honestly, short term looking to see what happens, because I think in the next year, and again, I'm speaking as both somebody who teaches it, at the college level, but also I'm a practitioner still. I'm running an RFP as we speak, about to, go through that process for our spend. And yeah, it's going to be, the next year is going to be interesting. Right now, but it's still in our shippers' favor. But in the next year, with the capacity being down, I think it could be a challenge, right, to find capacity, and rates could go up. So how you negotiate, how you build partnerships is real critical. But I think it definitely all the above, really. I think just making you more, it forces you to be more creative when you don't have maybe the capacity you had before. But again, where does automated driving at some point come in? I don't think in the near term, but maybe in the next 10, 15 years, it could start to seep in.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a good question.
Is there anybody else that wants to chime in on this one before we move on? All right, then we'll go to question number 4. So here we're looking at sustainability. What trends are you seeing in supply chain sustainability, your company's industries?
Great. Hi. Good
Yeah.
good evening, everyone. Rance Matthews here. Just checking. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I still see Jay. But really happy to be here with you this evening. Having worked in supply chain for over 30 years, and as mentioned on Ravi's slide, it was really great to see the importance of supply chain, really increase, mostly due to necessity during COVID, but even after COVID, that importance of supply chain is continuing to be important at the C-suite level, and sustainability is a big part of that. Current sustainability actions, but especially in the future, other actions that companies will take with regard to sustainability are going to have to encompass the supply chains that those companies have. And the sustainability is so important to the planet. 2023 was just rated the hottest year on record. So clearly, climate change continues to be a challenge from a planet standpoint. But sustainability is really a business imperative as well. And companies that really take action and make bold goals can really accelerate value creation and reposition themselves ahead of competitors over the long term. So really, one of the key trends is really integrating sustainability into the business strategy and making sure that whatever a company's business strategy is, that it's really sustainability is a big part of that. And to make sure that the revenue growth and the levers for revenue growth are clear, and how sustainability will enable that. Thinking about sales growth, clearly having a sustainable product, having sustainability goals can help with consumer demand, especially in segments of the market where the product it's really important to have sustainability claims and things like that, things like organic food, for example. Also brand loyalty, companies that are doing things more to a greater extent with sustainability have higher brand equity, more brand loyalty as well. Market as a way to differentiate, again, depends on the type of products in the industry, but really leaning in on sustainability commitments can differentiate products in the marketplace, and provide companies with a competitive advantage that can support sales growth. Being able to access new markets with the sustainability being more important for the planet. Clearly, governments around the world are putting additional regulations in place that have to do with sustainability. And as companies have the robust systems in place, whether it's product design, whether it's how they're running their business, to be able to meet these regulatory requirements outside of their home market gives more opportunities for revenue growth. And as mentioned, the ability to mitigate risk and develop supply chains, value chains that can be future-proofed, considering the climate change that's happening is also really critical. One example, through publicly disclosed things, that McCormick has been recognized as one of the world's most sustainable companies. And one of the areas that directly ties to sort of revenue, protecting revenue, but also growing revenue at McCormick is that they've developed a grown for good standard that really defines how production systems at the farm level are built to introduce resiliency into back at the value streams that the farmers would do. It would include regenerative agriculture, biodiversity and ecosystem services. And what it really does is it brings investment back at that farmer level that improves the resiliency of farmers and mitigates some of the climate change that's happening. That's really impacting the food industry, and then McCormick specific ingredients as well. And so this resiliency directly results in enabling supply and ensuring that the supply is going to be there, not just for the current demand, but the future demand as well.
That was good. I learned a lot right there, Brett. Thank you.
Thanks.
I just from a sort of from an operational perspective, the global shipping market it's a fascinating market for a lot of reasons. One is all of the different jurisdictions that you find yourself operating in. Overlaying it all is something called the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN body, and they promulgate a number of rules and regulations with respect to the international shipping markets. And they have been earnestly working towards more on the regulatory side, that Brad touched on. How do you impose, a regulatory regulatory goals to improve the efficiency of vessels, and vessels produce a lot of pollutants and a lot of emissions. For the most part, the propulsion in ships is diesel, and again, it creates a lot of emissions. So there are a couple of really fundamental regulations that the IMO has put in place in the last few years. One is called the EEXI, which every vessel essentially gets scored on an energy efficiency index. And then against that, every year, you've got something called the CII, your carbon intensity index, and you get measured against your benchmark, and you get fined if you don't comply. So there is just some outright regulation internationally. We also have regulations in the United States through the Environmental Protection Agency, in various tiers, tier 1, tier 2, we're up to tier 4 when it comes to regulations around emissions, particulate matter, and all of that with the goal of trying to make these essential supply chain assets more environmentally friendly. And it's been a long road, but it's certainly something that market participants are following, that they're active in. It creates all kinds of really interesting engineering challenges, on the manufacturing side, as well as going back to older assets and repurposing them and redoing propulsion and motive power plants to make them more efficient. So, we've seen vessels get converted from diesel to sort of a hybrid, not unlike a car, where you end up putting a whole bunch of batteries. At this point, it's only really working on vessels that are operating closer to shore, where you can get them recharged pretty quickly. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on when it comes to the design. But on the company level, back to sort of this fundamental question about, just looking at the question again, the balance of the goals with revenue growth. I mean, back to Brandon's point, it's in companies' best interest, to focus on sustainability and the E, the S, and the G, because it really ultimately is a sign of a healthy company. And I think I'm not a faculty member, so I haven't done the research, but I think there's a lot of work out there that's been done to show that the companies that have really good ESG scores also are really good from a shareholder return perspective. So I think it's absolutely worth spending your time on. And the CEOs I talk to, the companies I work with, they want to do this, but you do have to balance all of this against your near-term goals and your near-term realities of all your stakeholders. Well, the last thing I'll just throw in, if there's an organization in the U.S. called the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition, and check out their website. It's really cool. It really is an organic organization of folks involved in the North American transportation industry. And they've got a whole bunch of work groups, and they're really trying to find ways to work together to improve the sustainability of our industry. And a number of my clients are involved with it. And I think it's really interesting what they're doing. And so again, I'd encourage you all to follow that. Yeah, that's what I got generally.
I could add just a brief snippet to all that. It really kind of builds on what Brant and Michael have said. I've done a little bit of kind of, I guess you could say, research, kind of interest in what's a global metric for ESG, right? A global metric that measures all the things that Brant and Michael talked about, the companies measure themselves on, right, and drive improvement on. How do you tie that to financial performance, like Michael alluded to? But like, what's a global standard for that? And I think there's efforts underway to try to define that. It's not defined at this point, but I think that's something I think you could see in the next decade. A global way to define that, almost like a quarterly report to Wall Street to some degree. But I think it's still a ways away. But there's efforts to formally do that. You can go out there and research, and I think that's a trend you could see in the next decade. That takes all the things that Brant and Michael talked about. They obviously have lived and breathed it and led it at a very high level in their current role and past roles. And so it's like, but how is that measured, and how does that kind of formally tie back to a company's financial measurement or financial performance, and how is it judged, a standard for the globe? So interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, and the asset managers are struggling with this too. As an asset manager, and your investors want to put their money into funds that are ESG focused, how do you assure your investors that all the companies in your portfolio are meeting that goal? So Houston's right. I mean, it's real time. I was having dinner with somebody who's responsible for that at a really, really large asset manager a couple of weeks ago, and they're spending a lot of effort on it, and it's going to be really interesting, because I think a lot of us do want, from our personal investing standpoint, to have our money in funds and in companies that are doing the right things and balancing these objectives as well as they can.
Thank you for that answer. And this again emphasizes the fact that I tell a lot of our students, especially the undergraduate students who are sustainability majors or thinking about sustainability, is you got to think about supply chain as well, because that's the way you're going to achieve the sustainability goals that you may be thinking about from your company's perspective. Moving on to the next question. This has been a pretty popular question among a lot of the participants. And as we discussed as a panelist before we prepared for this as well, this has been a popular question as well. How are the broader geopolitical issues, if I'm putting that in a very broad bucket out there, impacting supply chains? And I'll give you a few examples out here. You have obviously some conflicts going on out, in Ukraine and Israel-Gaza conflict. You have the EU regulatory issues, you have GDPR, tariffs, and so on. And then the more recent ones, and in fact, I was just looking up some news today at the whole Red Sea conflict that's happening and so on. So, all of these are putting pressures on supply chains. And if you can talk a little bit about that, that'll be wonderful.
Sure. Happy to kick that one off. So yeah, what's in the headlines today and the last few weeks have been these awful, attacks on commercial and also obviously military vessels in the Red Sea. And everybody's been reading about that. It's causing vessels to have to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. You've seen that in higher container rates if you're a shipper. If you own ships, to get that same container from Singapore to Rotterdam, instead of going through the Suez Canal, again, you got to go around the Cape of Good Hope. You're adding maybe 15 days to your voyage, $50,000 a day charter rate, another maybe $25,000 a day in fuel. I mean, you're quickly at over $1 million extra per voyage to get the same box to the same place. So it's a real impact. Sadly, we deal with these issues on and off over the years, different geopolitical issues. That what I just described, initially it was the container vessel operators are the ones diverting. Now, given the persistence of this, we're seeing owners of bulk vessels, tankers, ore carriers, and so forth doing this as well. We saw incredible impacts in in shipping and supply chain as a fallout of the war in Ukraine. Particularly you think about how much natural gas was supplied to Europe from Russia that's no longer going there, and how that gas is now getting there, and the United States is a big beneficiary of that. We had designed some terminals in the Gulf of Mexico to import natural gas 20 years ago. Those have all been repurposed for export, and we have a number of additional export terminals in place. It's really helped fortify the U.S. Gulf Coast economy when it comes to those exports. So it's one measurement of that, for example, is when you look at the growth in demand for crude oil, refined product, industrial gases. The demand growth on that last year was 3%. The ton mile growth was 10%. So it takes more ships, and if you're supply constrained on ships, then the charter rates really spike up. For better or worse, a lot of these markets are oversupplied with vessels, and so there has been a fair amount of supply to soak it up. But some of this stuff won't go back. Just and on a personal note, we talked earlier about the impact of the pandemic, the challenges of being a mariner at sea on these foreign flag vessels. They would typically go a couple months on, a couple months off. There were crews during the pandemic that weren't able to get off their ship for over a year because of all the restrictions in every port. Nobody wanted to take a mariner that had a different passport and process them, put them on a plane, and send them back home again. So it was a real challenge for a lot of those crew members. But yeah, this is all impacting the supply chains a lot. Ultimately, these things tend to then reverse themselves. Hopefully, for example, things in the Red Sea come back under control. One thing I'm seeing, this isn't directly related to the geopolitical, more towards maybe our last question. We're seeing the number of vessels being able to go through the Panama Canal reduce dramatically in the last 6-9 months, due to low water levels from Lake Gatun. And I pray that reverses itself. But it's one of the first times I've seen that level of natural impact on global shipping that wasn't a geopolitical event, that is actually a natural event. So pretty meaningful. And again, hopefully this is more an annual weather issue than the results of global warming. But yeah, not to leave you all on a doom and gloom note, but that is actually where I'd plan to stop. So I'll stop that and hand it over.
Yes, Michael, maybe building on some of your comments, maybe sticking with a little bit of doom and gloom and then hopefully brightening it up a little bit. But I think well said around so there's clearly, as outlined there, geopolitical issues that are in the news that unfortunately are happening today. And you also mentioned the Panama Canal, which is, a climate change sort of issue. And looking in the future, climate change issues are expected to drive even more geopolitical issues. So there is a bit of a interlinking there. And clearly with the geopolitical issues that exist now, there is an interconnectivity with what's going on in the world with trade. And as the shifting global trade flows continue, and supply chain disruptions come out that are directly related, there's also a butterfly effects that happen as well that may not be directly related to a specific localized issue, but it's sort of indirectly influenced by it. And specifically with the Red Sea, the one that we've talked about a bit, is that so clearly trade coming from Asia into Europe is directly impacted by having to go around the Horn of Africa, but it's also affecting trade flows in the coffee market, for example. So coffee is primarily grown in different places, but a lot of coffee is grown in Vietnam. A lot of coffee is grown in Brazil. The coffee that's grown in Brazil can go directly to Europe, via an Atlantic route. The coffee from Vietnam needs to go normally through the Suez Canal. So now that trade has been disrupted. What that has done is that's driven imbalances in the supply demand in the coffee market. So coffee prices are at a 25-year high, 30% increase over the last couple of weeks because of an increased demand for the Brazilian coffee. So nothing to do with the sort of, the weather or the specific supply demand related to coffee, but driven by the knock-on effect of the shipping issues. It has impacts that sort of transcend a specific, localized geopolitical issue in this case. So the interconnectivity is really, really important. Specifically thinking about geopolitical issues and how to, mitigate them, continuing with the COVID-19 strategies and efforts to build in more resiliency, really thinking through the offshore strategies and looking at bringing things, either repatriating in the country where the product is manufactured and sold, where the customers are, or bringing it, nearshoring it, and also considering sort of friendshoring, where the production is put in a place where there's favorable sort of trade relations, aligned sort of geopolitical aspects as well. So that's another trend that's definitely that offshoring, low-cost country focus. COVID certainly disrupted that, and the disruptions that we have that are continuing to put pressure on that trend as well.
Brian, I'm glad you mentioned about the idea of nearshoring and friendshoring, and the idea. So one of the things that Jay and we talked about it as well a lot, and one of the research topics I'm exploring is on this idea and how it has changed. And one of the things I've noticed is, at least for S&P 500 manufacturing companies, pre-COVID, think about pre-2020 March, or slightly before that, to around September 2021, one of the things that we are finding is that kind of a shrinkage of the geographic spread. Not a whole lot, but it is fairly significant in terms of, if I were to do, again, as being a professor, we have to do t-tests and other statistics out there. And if I were to do that, it is statistically significantly different. So that's what tells us the story that, okay, there is some real impact of this. And it seems what you're suggesting is that you're starting to see even more of these things may happen in the future as these kind of different issues pop up at different places. So it seems like that's what's going to happen. So again, it's not a doom and gloom. It's something that we have to react to, I guess. So Jay, if you want to.
Yeah, we can move on to question 6 then. And so this question is all about frictions existing between suppliers and customers. So what kind of frictions are you dealing with out there between your company and suppliers, or maybe with your customers? And just kind of let us know what's going on out there.
So coming out of coming out of COVID and going through COVID, the relationships with suppliers and customers were truly tested with the supply disruptions and the other challenges involved, as well as the sort of hyperinflation that hit. And clearly, a lot of the relationships were tested. A lot of the relationships improved. Some of the relationships did not, and had to be sort of either reset or new relationships set up. But with those learnings that happened, it definitely sets up the supplier-customer relationships at a lot of companies in a better position than before COVID. So some of the current frictions, clearly we've been talking about the supply disruption. So the ability to ensure that the supply is there and to manage that type of supply risk is and remains one of the key frictions. The other one, as Michael mentioned a bit, also is that the inflation has flowed through the value chains to a higher extent than in the last 40 plus years with all the inflation, and not only on labor but on materials and on logistics and freight and just about every other input cost as well. So this put tension in the system, but that tension remains now as some of that inflation has tempered. So we've had disinflation in a number of different areas, and even deflation in some areas, especially some of the commodity related areas. So there is a tension there in that pricing, that cost structure that's being worked through with supplier and customer. Another one is cyber risk, and it's notably impacted several companies' earnings, either cyber issues at the company itself or at the suppliers. But cyber continues to be another area that's still exists with customers, and it really reinforces the need to continue to drive more transparency, including the different sub-tiers of production. So not just understanding where the production is coming from with the direct supplier, but who their supplier is, who their supplier is, and so on. So the multi-tier is really important, and really continuing to drive through that improved collaboration and using AI and digitalization and the latest technology tools to facilitate that.
Yes, allow me to share my challenge with internal customers at a hospital setting. So I agree with Brian, like the relationship with the customers has changed, right? Like it's not the same thing for a clinical team when you introduce a back order once in a while, or a substitution where you introduce a constant all the time, right? Our clinical teams are very stressed staff. We also have a shortage of nurses, so that creates pressure on the system itself. So just having that constant, always changing the product that they use comes with a challenge, right? So I just want to share that. Also with the reporting piece, because now we have substitution. So when we want to look at the inventory trends for a specific product category, now we need to be looking at the different products that we use to compensate you for that demand, but also if they're in different unit of measures. Right now, maybe we get it from a vendor from a pack and the other one from a case. So how do we overcome those challenges to keep operating as efficient as possible? Thank you.
I'll just add a couple of comments on this from my standpoint. Industry-wise, I think you see projects being put on hold. I work in a large industrial type of industry, steel related, of course. So, you have customers that have put projects on hold. You have backlogs of work and so forth. And then you have sort of fluctuating, then all of a sudden interest rates are cut 2 or 3, reports in a row, quarters in a row, and then bam, everybody wants to have a project done. So I've seen that, certainly that sort of, kind of whiplash, bullwhip effect, I guess, if you will, to some degree, kind of a combo. I would say one last thing to say, and the logistics side of it that I primarily manage. I mentioned kind of earlier in my career, where you had, multi-year contracts for freight. You'd have 2 or 3 year contracts, right? And then now you really get to where a year contract is really a lot to try to do. And I will say that this time around, and I'm trying to push to actually get back to multi-year contracts with this bid. So I just, I think that's one thing I've seen especially with the pandemic we talked about, that it's been more volatile. There's been a lot more uncertainty about cost and capacity and labor and all that. And then demand and the economy, it's all the factors are much more volatile, less dependable than they at least have been in the past. So it's a challenge, but I think it's made a more volatile environment. And now the question is, will we get back to kind of multi-year agreements like in logistics, for instance? So it's a couple of points there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking at our time, and man, it's 5:59 p.m. Unfortunately, even if our participants have any questions, I don't think we can get to that, but I'll be happy to route it to our panelists, and then we can get those answers. So if I may add one last thing, which is thank you to the panelists. This is an amazing set of insights that you have given us. Every time I talk to a supply chain professional, I learn something new, and I took copious notes out here, which is just amazing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Trish.
Yeah, so thank you all for, we had 4 awesome panelists tonight, Michael, Houston, Brant, and Max. It was so great hearing your thoughts on supply chain, about your experiences on these topics, and of course, about your future insights. I personally learned a tremendous amount, and I know our audience did as well. We really appreciate your time tonight. I also want to thank Robbie and Jay for putting together such a great webinar. It definitely left us all with a lot to think about. Our next and last webinar in the series will be on Thursday, March 14th, and that is on enhancing data analysis through the integration of economic theory. So it kind of, I think, will just kind of piggyback on this, and it'll be, again, really insightful. So we hope to see you there, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.